Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Tony White, this Nebraska defense get back to form Saturday afternoon against Purdue. I want to dive into some of the biggest differences that we saw with this Nebraska defense on Saturday against Purdue that, quite frankly, I don't think we saw Friday night against Illinois. And I think it starts with that Nebraska defense killer instinct that we saw all of 2023. We hopped on right after the football game against Illinois and said it just didn't seem like that Nebraska defense had that killer instinct that they've had in 2023 and that they've had to start the 2024 season. I felt like they got back to that. Hey, this is a Nebraska defense that can go out and impact the game in a big way, can go out and win football games. That mentality was there against Purdue. Want to dive into just some of what we saw for this Nebraska defense against Purdue that I think led to kind of this Nebraska defense rebounding in such a big way. Now, before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. Y'all know I love talking this Nebraska program. The amount of support y'all continue to show, all the Go Big Reds you guys throw in the comments section means the world. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, would love to hear some of your biggest takeaways, as well as I'm sure many of y'all have watched this Nebraska game back a couple of times since Saturday afternoon. Without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with creating negative plays. This was the biggest difference I think we saw on Saturday versus what we saw from Illinois Friday night. You go back to that Illinois game on Friday night, only 2 sacks, 2 tackles for loss, only 4 negative plays created for this Nebraska defense on Friday night. You take a look at what we saw from Purdue, 5 sacks, 9 tackles for loss. This Nebraska defense was swarming behind the lines of scrimmage, and I think it starts with just a little bit more of an aggressive play calling from Tony White. And you go back to that game against Illinois, I think there's reasons why Tony White was a little bit less aggressive with that front seven. And I think it starts with one, Illinois has 2 boundary receivers that are really good, NFL caliber dudes in Zachary Franklin and Pat Bryant. And I think secondly, when Tommy Hill goes out with the injury, you're going with a backup cornerback with elite boundary wide receivers. I felt like Tony White probably wanted to protect that Nebraska secondary, not give up as many explosive plays. So you saw a little bit, you didn't see as much of that 5-man pressure. You didn't see as many blitz packages that Tony White was throwing at that Illinois defense. And I think it largely was because, one, we're nervous about the elite wide receivers that Illinois has. I think those are 2 really good wide receivers, but I think just as importantly, not having your top cornerback for that game in Tommy Hill certainly made Tony White a little bit more cautious. Now, I think that cautious got thrown into the wind a little bit for 2 different reasons. One, Purdue's wide receivers not nearly as good as Illinois, but I think more importantly, look, Sayre Wright's come in and I think has played phenomenal football for Nebraska. I think he's playing like one of the better cornerbacks in the Big Ten so far. Again, small sample size, but he was really impressive against Illinois. Thought he was really impressive against Purdue this weekend. And now that Sayre Wright, I think, has gained the trust of Tony White and this defensive coaching staff, I think you're seeing Nebraska get a little bit more comfortable leaving Sayre Wright on some islands. And you saw a lot of 5-man pressures. You saw a lot of 6-man pressures. You saw them sending some safeties and linebackers in this football game to try to just be a little bit more of that smothering defense that we know Nebraska for. And the more negative plays this Nebraska unit can create, the more they can keep opposing offenses behind the change. That is when Tony White is at his best as a play caller. In those 3rd and long situations, when he can get really creative in terms of what he wants to do, that's when Tony White excels. They never really got into those situations against Illinois. It was a lot of 3rd and manageable. It was a lot of Illinois having the full playbook at their disposal in that football game, which kind of limits what Tony White can call on 3rd downs on defense. So I think creating negative plays, obviously, number one. Number two, and this one's pretty obvious too, stopping the run. What changed for Nebraska against Purdue as opposed to Illinois? One, again, I think Purdue's offensive line, the rushing game in general, is not as good. Like Illinois has a very good offensive line. Multiple guys on that offensive line I think will be playing on Sundays. But I think more importantly, you had much better play from the 2nd-level defenders playing the run. You go back to that Illinois game, a lot of missed tackles, a lot of linebackers not fitting the run the right way. I didn't think the safeties came down and played the run as well as they could have. You look at this game against Purdue and say, one, linebackers were significantly better. John Bullock is playing very good football. Mekhi Bayer playing very good football. It was nice to see Javin right back, but I thought the big storyline was Deshaun Singleton coming up and leading the team in run stops in this football game. You look at the 3-3-5 defense that Nebraska wants to run. When you are having some of that more speed on the football field, it is imperative that your second level defenders are flying to the football and making plays downhill in the run game. You saw Deshaun Singleton do that at a high level. And so, again, as Nebraska stopped the run, Purdue only ran the football for 50 yards. That's a complete turnaround from what we saw against Illinois, specifically in that second half. And I think another thing that, probably worked to Nebraska's favor was this defense wasn't on the field a ton in the second half. Nebraska's offense been doing a really good job all year, but specifically in that second half, I mean, Nebraska strung together multiple touchdown drives that were long, keeping the defense off the field. Because we said one of the biggest question marks we have is, some of the depth on the defensive line. Like Nash and Ty are playing a lot of football for this Nebraska defense, and I don't know if it's a lack of confidence in terms of the two deep on the defensive line, or it's just, hey, we want to keep Nash and Ty in the field because they're some of the best players in all of college football. Whatever that reason is, the better this offense can play complementary football and keep Nash and Ty kind of fresh going into the third and fourth quarter, that matters. And you saw a much better performance in the second half for this Nebraska defense because it seemed like this defensive line had a little bit more pop, was a little bit more fresh during the third and fourth quarter of this football game. Last thing that I thought was really impressive, he didn't allow any explosive plays. Now, how I identify, or I guess I should say define explosive plays, 20-plus yard plays. Purdue had 0 of them. You go back to the Illinois game, Illinois had 5. If you are a defense, and this pertains to whatever offense you're playing, if you can hold the offenses to 0 explosive plays, chances are you're going to have a good day on defense. Because if you can make a college football team, a college football offense execute 12, 14 plays, march the football down the field, not take penalties, not take drive killing plays like tackles for loss and sacks, you just got to tip your hat to the offense. But I think the reality of the situation is the best offenses in the country are able to generate explosive plays. If you're a Nebraska defense and you don't give up explosive plays, it's going to be very hard for an opposing offense to march the football down the field and score points. Why did Nebraska not give up explosive plays? One, I thought they tackled much better, but I think more importantly, the secondary in coverage, there was no blown assignments, which we saw a lot of against Illinois, like straight up busts, like guys just not covering the guys they were supposed to be doing. I think Illinois did a good job scheming some things up, but at the end of the day, like this is Tony White's defense. We don't expect those type of things. They cleaned that up in a significant way, but I think the biggest storyline was there was just not a lot of space in the passing attack for this Purdue offense. You take a look at the completions that Hudson Card made, some of them were just high-level tight window throws. You look at the yards after the catch for Purdue, they had only 50 of them. Like 50 yards after the catch is a very small number. That kind of speaks to the stickiness of Nebraska in coverage, the lack of blown coverages. When Purdue's wide receivers were catching the football, they didn't have a ton of room to operate after the catch. A lot of these college football offenses kind of bank on yards after the catch, getting guys wide open, letting them be playmakers in space. If you're Nebraska and say, hey, we're going to close in and we're not going to allow a lot of space, that's kind of the storyline. And you saw this Nebraska secondary, again, continue to be impressed, I should say, by Sayre Wright. If you don't give up explosive plays like Nebraska just didn't give up, like you're going to win a lot of football games against a lot of really good teams. So those were the 3 things that went, I thought, really well for Nebraska. The one thing I want to see continued on the defensive side of the football, I'll give a short amount of takes on the offense in a second, is got to be better on third downs. It was a problem against Illinois. It was a problem against Purdue. And again, Purdue only had 12 first downs. They were 7 to 15 on third downs. That's, again, you want to see Nebraska get off the field a little bit more. Quite frankly, it was probably a problem against Northern Iowa as well. Matt Rhule was not happy with the third down defense. That continues to be a struggle point for Nebraska. They were a really good defense on third down last year. I still think they're going to be a very good defense, but you want to see that get kind of cleaned up as you play a team like Rutgers that they want to just methodically move the chains. And when you have the opportunity to get an offense off the field, you got to be able to take advantage of it. outside of that, it was, in my opinion, just a flawless game by this Nebraska defense. He ended up getting the offensive coordinator for Purdue fired. On the offensive side of the football, I continue to be really impressed with Dylan. We don't need to talk too much about it, but it was one really good to see them have a priority on getting Ja'Cory Barney the football. This kid's a playmaker. I thought you saw Emmett Johnson emerge as well. I think there's an element where Nebraska knows they have Isaiah Nair and know they have Jamal Banks on the outside, but I still think they're trying to find some other kind of rotational playmakers in this offense. Ja'Cory Barney's a guy. Like, you can tell Nebraska really likes this kid. They are getting him the football in every single way possible. I think Emmett Johnson right now is running the football the best. We kind of talked about this on Sunday. Matt Rhule said it heading into the 2024 season. What he said was, we got four really good running backs that we like. We want to see a running back or two really emerge. Dante Dowdle seemed to be the guy early in the season, but if you're Matt Rhule in Nebraska, I think you're kind of just going off the hot hand. And if Emmett Johnson has proven to be the hot hand right now, I think you go with him a little bit more against Rutgers. I think he gives you a little bit more juice at the second level. He's exceptional at making people miss. Forced 6 missed tackles in that game Saturday against Purdue. Like, Dante Dowdle's a hammer. He's attacking the line of scrimmage. I love what Dante Dowdle brings. We talk about a running back that can give you a little bit more explosiveness and juice. I'd probably say it's Emmett Johnson. So, going to be interested to see how they manage the running back room. I thought Passport was really good. Dylan Rhule, when you give him time, man, he can absolutely dice up a defense. And I thought the refs took away a few touchdowns, definitely one touchdown in that football game. Ramir Johnson probably should have caught that touchdown in the back end of the end zone. Dylan Rhule, he's playing some really good football. And if you're Nebraska, that was especially in the second half. One of the things for Nebraska, you got to be able to finish in the red zone. You had over 200 yards of total offense in the first half, came away with 0 points. You kind of know the kicking game isn't there. You got to make sure you're scoring touchdowns in the red zone. That's one thing you want to see cleaned up. You're seeing this Nebraska team, really start to play some really good football, but more importantly, like, when they're clearly the better team, they're playing like it, especially in the second half of this game. Those are my biggest takeaways, specifically on the defense. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.